Helen Carter stepped through the massive security checkpoint of the Galactic Council station with nothing but a simple black briefcase in her hand. The scanning beams washed over her body 3 times, each pass more thorough than the last. The alien security officers nodded and waved her through without a word. Behind her, the line of other species representatives stretched for nearly 100 meters, each waiting their turn to be stripped of weapons, defensive implants, and natural biological advantages. She watched as the Zephyrian delegate Crystal was forced to submit to the inhibitor bands that would seal his venom sacs for the duration of the council session. His 4 eyes glowed with barely contained anger as the bands clicked into place around his neck. The Korath warrior next to him had already surrendered his ceremonial blade and the bio-enhancement pods that amplified his natural strength. Even the peaceful Aetherian ambassador had to remove her telepathic dampening crown, a device that prevented her from accidentally reading the thoughts of others. Helen felt their stares as she walked past the weapon storage area. Row upon row of confiscated items filled the chamber. Plasma rifles, sonic disruptors, gravity hammers, and dozens of other devices she couldn't even identify. Each item was carefully labeled with its owner's name and species. The storage room could have armed a small fleet, yet she carried nothing more dangerous than a stylus. The human diplomatic quarters were located on the station's upper level, away from the main traffic areas. Helen found Commander Jake Morrison waiting for her in the briefing room. His uniform was crisp and his expression calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Jake had been her military attached for 3 years, and she had learned to read his moods. "The Velinari delegation arrived this morning," Jake said as she set down her briefcase. "They brought twice as many security personnel as usual. Something has them spooked?" Helen nodded and moved to the large window that overlooked the main council chamber. The circular room could hold representatives from over 200 species, though only about 60 were regular attendees. The speaking platform stood in the center, surrounded by tiered seating that rose in concentric circles. Each species had their own section, designed to accommodate their unique physiological needs. The Aquarian delegation sat in water-filled tanks, while the silicon-based Christic representatives required specially heated platforms. "Have you ever wondered why we get to walk in there empty-handed?" Jake asked, joining her at the window. "Every other species treats the council chamber like a potential battlefield. They plan for ambush, assassinations, and hostile takeovers. We just stroll in with a briefcase and a smile." Helen had wondered about that many times. The privilege had existed for over a century, dating back to humanity's first contact with the Galactic Council. The official records were vague about the exact circumstances, but the result was clear. Humans were the only species trusted to enter the council chamber without surrendering their weapons. Not because they didn't carry any, but because they were allowed to carry them if they chose to. "My grandfather served as an attached during the Zephyrian crisis," Jake continued. "He told me stories about Ambassador Kane and the choices he made. Said it was the kind of decision that changes everything for a species. Makes you either trusted forever or hated for generations." The first delegates were already taking their seats in the chamber below. Helen could see the subtle positioning that spoke of old grudges and new alliances. The Korath delegation sat as far from the Velinari as possible, their warrior culture clashing with the technological supremacist cold logic. The Zephyrian cluster kept their distance from everyone, their natural paranoia amplified by their toxic biology. "The young ones always ask about it," Helen said, watching a group of junior diplomats from various species gathered near the viewing area. "They whisper about the human exception like it's some kind of special magic. Most of them have never seen a human carrying a weapon, so they think we're just naturally peaceful." Jake laughed quietly. "If only they knew about our history. The wars, the violence, the centuries of conflict before we reached the stars. We're probably the most naturally violent species in the council." Helen turned away from the window as her communication device chimed. The session would begin in 30 minutes. She opened her briefcase and reviewed the agenda one final time. 3 major disputes were scheduled for discussion. The Korth-Villanary territorial conflict had been simmering for months. The Zephyrian trade embargo was damaging relationships with a dozen neutral species. And there were rumors of a new weapon system that had everyone nervous. The Drakari incident, she said suddenly. That's where it started, isn't it? The reason we're trusted. Jake nodded slowly. Captain Brooks and the Neptune's Dawn. My grandfather was just a junior officer then, but he remembered every detail. Said it was the first time anyone had ever seen a human ship deliberately sacrifice itself for aliens. Not for territory or resources or political advantage, just because it was the right thing to do. Helen closed her briefcase and straightened. Her jacket? The weight of a century of human diplomacy rested on her shoulders. Every ambassador before her had carried the same burden, the knowledge that their actions would be judged not just for their immediate consequences, but for how they reflected on humanity's place in the galaxy. The chamber was filling rapidly now. She could see the nervous energy among the delegates, the way they glanced at the empty human section and then at each other. Something was different about today's session. The usual pre-meeting conversations were quieter, more intense. Even the normally boisterous Korath delegation seemed subdued. Whatever happens in there, Jake said as they prepared to leave, remember that you're not just representing humanity. You're representing the idea that someone can be trusted to do the right thing, even when it costs them everything. Helen picked up her briefcase and walked toward the door. In a few minutes, she would take her seat in the council chamber, surrounded by representatives of dozens of species who had surrendered their weapons and defenses. She would sit there with nothing but her words and her commitment to finding peaceful solutions to impossible problems. And everyone in that room would know that if violence erupted, if the carefully maintained peace of the council collapsed, she would be the one they turned to for answers. The corridor leading to the council chamber was lined with the flags of member species. The human flag was simple compared to most, just a blue field with a single white star. But Helen knew that flag carried more weight than any weapon. It represented a promise made over a century ago, renewed by every human diplomat who had walked this corridor before her. She could hear the murmur of voices from the chamber ahead. In moments, she would discover what crisis had brought them all together, and whether humanity's unique position in the galaxy would be enough to prevent another war. The year was 2387 when Captain Lisa Brooks first laid eyes on the massive space battle that would change humanity's fate forever. The Neptune's Dawn had been conducting routine exploration along the outer rim when the long-range sensors detected energy signatures unlike anything in their databases. Lisa ordered the ship to investigate, expecting to find some new natural phenomenon or perhaps evidence of an ancient civilization. What they found instead was war on a scale that defied imagination. Hundreds of ships moved in complex formations across a battlefield that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The vessels were clearly of alien design, their hulls gleaming with exotic materials and weapons that turned space itself into a canvas of destruction. Beams of pure energy lanced between the fleets while massive projectiles moved at impossible speeds through the void. Lisa stood on the bridge of her small exploration vessel and watched the carnage unfold on the main screen. The Neptune's Dawn carried a crew of 43. Old scientists and explorers who had volunteered for humanity's first deep space mission. Their ship was designed for discovery, not combat. Against the massive warships battling in the distance, they would be nothing more than an annoyance. "Captain, we're receiving a transmission," reported Communications Officer Danny Walsh. "It's not in any language our computers recognize, but the universal translator is making some progress." The main screen flickered and resolved into an image that made everyone on the bridge gasp. The creature speaking was clearly intelligent but completely alien. Its skin was a pale blue color that seemed to shift and flow like water. 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on its face looked directly at them with what appeared to be desperation. "Unknown vessel," the translation came through with mechanical precision. "You must flee this area immediately. The Drakari horde shows no mercy to any who witness their attacks. Your ship appears to be of a design we have not encountered. Please escape while you still can." Lisa looked at her crew and saw her own thoughts reflected in their faces. This was first contact with an alien species, the moment humanity had dreamed of for centuries. But it was happening in the middle of what appeared to be a massacre. "Danny, can you get me a direct channel to whoever sent that message?" she asked. "Working. On it, Captain. The signal is coming from a ship that's trying to break away from the main battle. It looks like it's taken heavy damage." The screen shifted to show a sleek vessel that was clearly different from the aggressive warships pursuing it. Where the attacking ships were covered in spikes and weapon ports, this one had smooth curves and what looked like observation windows. It was obviously not built for war. "This is Captain Lisa Brooks of the Earth vessel Neptune's Dawn," Lisa said into the communications array. "Can you tell us what's happening here?" The alien's 4 eyes widened in what might have been surprise. "Earth vessel? We have no record of your species in our databases. I am Elder Thizes of the Etherian Diplomatic Corps. I was returning from peace negotiations when the Drakari launched their attack. The Council fleet was caught completely unprepared." Lisa watched as the diplomatic vessel shuddered under enemy fire. Its shields were failing and several sections were already venting atmosphere. The attacking ships were closing in for what looked like a final assault. "Elder Thizes, how many are aboard your vessel?" Lisa asked. 47 diplomats and support staff from 12 different species. We carry the peace accords that could end the war between the Korath and Velinari. If those documents are lost, millions will die in the renewed fighting." Lisa felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. In the distance, she could see the Council fleet retreating in disorder. The Drakari ships were faster and more heavily armed. They had turned what should have been a routine diplomatic mission into a slaughter. "Captain," said her tactical officer. "Lieutenant Pete Ryan, I'm reading massive energy buildup in the Drakari flagship. Whatever they're planning, it's going to be big." Lisa understood immediately. The Drakari weren't just trying to destroy the diplomatic vessel. They were preparing to eliminate it so completely that nothing would remain. No survivors, no evidence, no hope for peace. "Options, people," she said to her bridge crew. "What can we do to help?" "Captain, we have no weapons that could damage ships of that size," Pete said quietly. "Our exploration lasers might scratch their paint." The Neptune's Dawn was never meant for combat. Lisa looked at the tactical display again. The Drakari ships were moving into position around the diplomatic vessel like hunters surrounding wounded prey. In minutes, it would be over. The peace accords would be destroyed, the diplomats killed, and the war would continue. "What about ramming speed?" Lisa asked suddenly. The bridge went completely silent. Everyone stared at their captain as if she had lost her mind. "Captain, that would be suicide," said her first officer, Commander Amy Foster. "Even if we could damage their flagship, we'd be destroyed in the process." Lisa nodded slowly. "But it might create enough confusion for the diplomatic vessel, too. Escape. The Drakari seem focused on preventing any survivors. If we can disrupt their formation for even a few minutes, Elder Thizes might be able to reach the Council fleet." "Captain, think about what you're saying," Amy said. "We'd be sacrificing our entire crew for aliens we've never met. People back on Earth don't even know other species exist." Lisa looked at each member of her bridge crew. These were good people who had volunteered for a mission of exploration and discovery. They had families waiting for them back home, dreams and plans for the future. She had no right to ask them to throw their lives away for strangers. "I'm not ordering anyone to do this," she said finally. "But if we don't act, those diplomats will die, and from what Elder Thizes said, their deaths will lead to a war that kills millions more. We're the only ones in position to help." The bridge was quiet for several long moments. Then Danny Walsh spoke up from his communications station. "Captain, I volunteer. Those diplomats are trying to make peace. That's worth something." One by one, the rest of the crew added their voices. Pete Ryan from Tactical, Amy Foster despite her objections, Chief Engineer Carl Rodriguez from the engine room. All 43 members of the Neptune's Dawn crew agreed to sacrifice themselves for beings they had never met, Lisa felt tears in her eyes as she gave the order. Set course for the Drakari flagship, maximum speed. All hands prepare for impact. The Neptune's Dawn turned toward the massive enemy vessel and accelerated. The small exploration ship struck the Drakari flagship at nearly the speed of light, creating an explosion that could be seen across the entire battlefield. The flagship's shields collapsed and its weapon systems went offline just long enough for Elder Thises to escape. 17 members of the Neptune's Dawn crew survived in emergency pods, including Lisa herself. They were rescued by the Council fleet and brought to safety. But their sacrifice had done more than save the diplomatic vessel. It had shown the galaxy that humanity was capable of putting the greater good above their own survival. Elder Thises kept the peace accords safe and delivered them to the Council. The war between the Korath and Velinari ended within months. And when humanity was invited to join the Galactic Council, they were granted a privilege that no other species had ever received: the right to enter the council chambers completely unarmed, trusted to act in the best interests of all. Helen Carter took her seat in the council chamber as the session began, but she could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. The usual diplomatic pleasantries were rushed and strained. Representatives from different species kept glancing at each other with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Something had changed since the last session, and Helen suspected she was about to find out what. The council chairman, an elderly Christic named Vorth, whose silicon-based body glowed with a dull orange light, called for order. His voice resonated through the chamber with the grinding sound of rocks sliding against each other. We gather today to address a matter of extreme urgency. The Velinari Collective has made a discovery that threatens the balance of power in our galaxy. Helen watched as Overlord Zenth of the Velinari delegation rose from his seat. The Velinari were tall, thin beings with metallic skin that reflected light in strange patterns. Their culture prized technological advancement above all else, and they had a reputation for viewing other species as primitive and inferior. Zenth's artificial eyes scanned the chamber with cold calculation. "Fellow council members," Zenth began, his voice artificially enhanced to carry across the chamber. 3 months ago, our scientists achieved a breakthrough that will revolutionize warfare and ensure lasting peace throughout the galaxy. We have developed a weapon capable of destroying entire star systems with a single activation. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs and angry shouts. Helen felt her blood run cold. A weapon that could destroy star systems meant billions of lives could be ended with the push of a button. The implications were staggering. The device works by destabilizing the nuclear fusion process within a star, Zenth continued, seemingly oblivious to the chaos his words had caused. Once activated, it causes the star to collapse into a black hole within minutes. Any planets, space stations, or ships in the system are instantly destroyed. War Master Thokrin of the Korath delegation slammed his massive fist on his speaking podium. The Korath were a warrior species, built like living tanks with thick gray skin and natural armor plating. Their culture respected strength and honor above all else, and they had no patience for what they saw as cowardly tactics. "This is an abomination," Thokrin roared, his voice carrying the authority of countless battles. "War should be fought between warriors, not by destroying innocent civilians from the safety of another star system. The Velinari have created a weapon for cowards." Zenth's metallic features shifted into what might have been a smile. "The Korath speak of honor while their fleets mass at our borders. Intelligence reports indicate that you plan to invade our territory within the next standard month. This weapon ensures that such an invasion would be suicide." Helen stood slowly, her movement causing conversations throughout the chamber to stop. The human section was positioned at the center of the seating arrangement, a symbol of humanity's role as mediators. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly without artificial enhancement. "Overlord Zenth, are you threatening to use this weapon against the Korath homeworld?" Zenth turned his artificial eyes toward her. "Ambassador Carter, I am stating a fact. If the Korath fleet enters Velinari space, we will defend ourselves using any means necessary. The weapon has already been deployed to our border systems. The chamber exploded into chaos. Representatives from dozens of species began shouting. At once, some demanded immediate action against the Velinari. Others called for emergency evacuation of systems near the border. The Aquarian delegation was making high-pitched sounds that their translators couldn't process. While the Zephyrian cluster had begun secreting defensive toxins in their fear, Helen remained standing, waiting for the noise to die down. She had seen diplomatic crises before, but nothing of this magnitude. The Velinari had essentially declared themselves the supreme power in the galaxy. Any species that opposed them could be wiped out completely. The Korath Empire will not be intimidated by threats, Thokran declared once order was restored. Our fleets are already moving to counter this aggression. If the Velinari want war, they will have it. Then you will have doomed your entire species, Zenth replied calmly. The weapon is automated and will activate the moment your ships cross our borders. Approximately 8 billion Korath will die within the first hour of your invasion. Helen felt sick. The two most powerful military forces in the galaxy were moving toward a conflict that would result in genocide. The Korath were too proud to back down from a challenge, and the Velinari were too convinced of their superiority to compromise. There must be another solution, she said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. Both sides have legitimate concerns that can be addressed through negotiation. The time for negotiation has passed, Zenth said. The Korath have been massing fleets for months. They clearly intend to invade our territory and subjugate our people. We will not allow this to happen. And we will not bow to alien cowards who hide behind weapons of mass destruction, Thokran countered. The Korath have never backed down from a fight, and we will not start now. Helen looked around the chamber and saw the faces of representatives from dozens of species. Each one was calculating how this conflict would affect their own people. The Etherian delegation looked terrified, their naturally peaceful nature, making them physically ill at the thought of such violence. The Zephyrian cluster was already preparing to leave, their paranoid culture assuming that everyone would eventually become a target. The galaxy is watching, Helen said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. What happens here today will determine whether we move forward as a civilized council of species or descend into an age of fear and destruction. But even as she spoke, she could see that her words were having little effect. The Velinari were convinced that their technological superiority gave them the right to impose their will on others. The Korath believed that backing down from a challenge would show weakness that would only invite more aggression. The other species in the chamber were choosing sides based on old alliances and ancient grudges. The silicon-based Christic sided with the Velinari out of respect for their technological achievements. The warrior cultures naturally gravitated toward the Korath position. The peaceful species found themselves caught in the middle, unwilling to support either side but unable to offer alternatives. Helen realized that traditional diplomacy was failing. The careful balance of power that had kept the galaxy stable for centuries was crumbling. Soon, fleets would be moving toward battle, and once the fighting started, it would be almost impossible to stop. She thought about the stories Jake had told her, about previous human ambassadors and the choices they had made. Each one had faced a moment when normal diplomatic solutions weren't enough. Each one had been forced to make a decision that would define humanity's role in the galaxy. As she looked out at the chaos in the chamber, Helen knew that her moment had arrived. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of the Velinari and Korath, but the survival of galactic civilization itself. And somehow, she would have to find a way to prevent a war that both sides seemed determined to fight. Helen Carter stood in the chaos of the council chamber and felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The shouting matches between species representatives had devolved into something approaching violence, with several delegations already walking out in protest. As she watched the galaxy's carefully constructed peace crumble around her, her mind drifted back to the stories that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be a human diplomat. Ambassador Robert Kane had faced a similar crisis 40 years earlier when the Zephyrian Korath War threatened to consume half the galaxy. Helen remembered reading his personal journals during her diplomatic training, trying to understand the mind of a man who had made impossible choices. The Zephyrians had developed a biological weapon that could kill any carbon-based life form, while the Korath had created ships that could crack planets in half. Both sides were convinced that the other planned to commit genocide. Kane had spent months trying to negotiate a peace treaty, but every attempt had failed. The Zephyrians were too paranoid to trust any agreement, while the Korath were too proud to accept anything less than total victory. The war had already claimed millions of lives and showed no signs of ending. That was when Kane made his decision. He had walked into the council chamber and announced that he would personally guarantee the peace treaty by becoming a hostage to both sides. For 20 years, he lived alone on a barren moon in neutral space, monitored constantly by both Zephyrian and Korath forces. Any violation of the peace treaty by either side would result in his immediate execution. The arrangement worked because both species knew that Kane was willing to die rather than let the war continue. Helen had met Kane once, near the end of his exile. He was a broken man, aged far beyond his years by the isolation and constant stress. But when she asked him if he regretted his decision, he had smiled and said that 20 years of personal suffering was a small price to pay for the millions of lives that had been saved. Ambassador Mary Collins had made a different kind of sacrifice. 15 years later, when the Velinari attempted to conquer the primitive John homeworld, the John were a species that had barely developed spaceflight, but their planet contained rare minerals that the Velinari needed for their technology. When the conquest began, Collins had offered to give up her family and her life on Earth to serve as a permanent advocate for the John people. She had spent the rest of her career living among the John, learning their customs and protecting their interests in the galactic community. Her own children grew up without knowing their mother, and her husband eventually remarried. But the John survived as a free species, and Collins became something of a legend among the younger diplomatic corps. Then there was Ambassador Paul Stevens, who had dedicated his entire career to mediating between species that had been at war for millennia. The Christic and the Velinari had been fighting over mining rights in the Outer Rim for over 1,000 years before Stevens arrived. The conflict had become so complex that both sides had forgotten what they were originally fighting about. Stevens had spent 30 years of his life shuttling between the two species, gradually building trust and understanding. He had learned both of their languages, studied their cultures, and eventually managed to broker a peace that lasted for decades. The stress of the constant mediation had eventually killed him, but his funeral was attended by representatives from both species, who had come to see him as a trusted friend. Helen understood now why humans were trusted to enter the council chamber. Unarmed, it wasn't because they were naturally peaceful or morally superior to other species. It was because they had proven repeatedly that they would sacrifice everything, including their own lives, for the greater good. The other species didn't fear human weapons because they knew that humans would turn those weapons on themselves. Before allowing galactic civilization to collapse, the tradition of human diplomatic sacrifice had become so well established that other species expected it. When a crisis arose that threatened galactic peace, everyone looked to the human ambassador to find a solution. And that solution almost always involved the human paying a terrible personal price. As Helen watched the Velinari and Korath delegations prepared to leave the chamber, she realized that her moment had arrived. The crisis was beyond normal diplomatic solutions. The Velinari had a weapon that could destroy star systems, and they were threatening to use it. The Korath had fleets moving toward the border, and their warrior culture wouldn't allow them to back down from a challenge, but Helen also understood something that the other species didn't. The reason humans were trusted wasn't just because they were willing to sacrifice themselves. It was because they understood that sometimes the threat of sacrifice was more powerful than the sacrifice itself. The other species in the galaxy had learned to respect human moral authority because they knew that humans would give up everything to maintain it. She thought about her own family back on Earth. Her daughter Emma was starting college next year, and her son David was captain of his high school football team. Her husband Mark had been patient about the long separations that came with diplomatic service, but she knew he worried about her safety. If she made the choice that she was considering, she might never see any of them again. The chamber was emptying rapidly now. The villainary delegation was already at the doors, followed closely by the Korath. Other species were choosing sides or simply fleeing the inevitable conflict. Soon, the careful balance of power that had kept the galaxy stable for over a century would be gone. Helen looked at her briefcase and thought about the simple tools of diplomacy it contained. Treaties, agreements, and protocols that had been developed over decades of careful negotiation. All of it was about to become meaningless. If she couldn't find a way to prevent the coming war, she remembered something her predecessor had told her during the transition briefing. The burden of being a human diplomat isn't just representing humanity, he had said. It's representing the idea that someone can be trusted to do the right thing even when it costs them everything. That's why we're allowed to carry weapons into the council chamber. Not because we might use them against others, but because everyone knows we'll use them against ourselves if necessary. Helen stood up and walked toward the center of the chamber. The few remaining delegates turned to look at her, wondering what the human ambassador could possibly say that would make a difference. She set her briefcase on the speaking platform and opened it slowly. Inside, along with her diplomatic materials, was a small plasma pistol. It was a simple weapon, designed for personal protection rather than warfare. But in the context of the council chamber, it represented something much more significant. It was a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice that human diplomats were prepared to make. Helen picked up the weapon and held it where everyone could see it. The chamber fell completely silent as the remaining delegates realized what she was about to do. Helen Carter held the plasma pistol in her steady hand as the council chamber fell into absolute silence. The few remaining delegates stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to horror. She had their complete attention now, something that hours of traditional diplomacy had failed to achieve. "I call for an emergency session," Helen said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "All delegations are to return immediately. What I have to say affects every species in this galaxy." The chamber's communication system activated automatically, sending recall signals to every delegation that had left. Within minutes, representatives began filing back into their seats. The villainary delegation returned first, followed by the Korath. Word was spreading through the station that the human ambassador was making some kind of unprecedented statement. Overlord Xanth of the Velinari looked at the weapon in Helen's hand with his artificial eyes. "Ambassador Carter, surely you do not intend to threaten this assembly with violence. Such an action would be completely against human diplomatic tradition." Helen smiled sadly. "You're right, Overlord Xanth. I'm not threatening anyone in this chamber. I'm threatening myself." The statement sent a ripple of shock through the assembled delegates. War Master Thokrin leaned forward in his seat, his warrior instincts trying to understand what kind of tactical advantage the human might be seeking. "The Velinari have developed a weapon that can destroy star systems," Helen continued, keeping the pistol visible but pointed away from anyone. "The Korath have fleets moving toward the border. Both sides are convinced that war is inevitable. But I have a different proposal." She paused and looked around the chamber, making eye contact with representatives from dozens of species. "Humanity will withdraw from galactic civilization entirely if this war proceeds. Every human colony will be evacuated. Every trade agreement will be terminated. Every diplomatic mission will be recalled. And every human in this galaxy will return to Earth." The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. The threat was so unexpected that most delegates didn't know how to respond. Helen continued speaking over the noise. "The withdrawal will be permanent. Humanity will seal our borders and have no further contact with galactic civilization. We will not trade with you, negotiate with you, or mediate your disputes. The galaxy will continue without us." Elder Thizes of the Etheran delegation stood up slowly, her blue skin paling to an almost white color. "Ambassador Carter, you cannot be serious. Humanity has been the backbone of galactic diplomacy for over a century. Without human mediation, the Council will collapse within years. Helen nodded. That's exactly right, Elder Thizes, and that's why I'm making this offer. If the Villanary and Korath cannot find a peaceful solution to their dispute, then clearly the system of galactic civilization has failed. Rather than watch it destroy itself in a war that will kill billions, humanity chooses to remove itself from the equation. Overlord Zenth's metallic features showed the first sign of emotion Helen had ever seen from him. You would abandon your colonies, your trade networks, your entire galactic presence, just to prevent a war between two species? Yes, Helen said simply, because that's what humans do. We don't fight wars we can't win, and we don't stand by while innocent people die. If the only way to prevent genocide is to remove ourselves from the galaxy, then that's what we'll do. The chamber was completely silent now. Every delegate was calculating what the galaxy would look like without human involvement. The humans had become the mediators in dozens of ongoing disputes. They facilitated trade between species that couldn't stand each other. They provided neutral ground for negotiations that would otherwise be impossible. War Master Thokran stood up, his massive frame dominating his section of the chamber. The Korath respects strength and honor. What you propose is neither. You would flee rather than fight. Helen met his gaze steadily. I would sacrifice everything I value to prevent a war that will accomplish nothing but mutual destruction. The Velinary weapon will destroy your homeworld, War Master. Your fleets will be annihilated. But even if you somehow won, what would be left? A galaxy full of dead worlds and bitter enemies. She turned to address Overlord Zenth. And you, Overlord. Your weapon will make you feared throughout the galaxy. But fear isn't respect. Every species will be planning ways to destroy you before you can destroy them. You'll spend the rest of your existence fighting defensive wars against enemies you created. The Velinary leader's artificial eyes flickered as he processed this information. You believe that human withdrawal would prevent this outcome? I believe that human withdrawal would force both sides to confront the reality of what they're about to do, Helen replied. Without human mediation, the Council will fragment into dozens of competing factions. The Etherian will ally with the Christic, the Zephyrian will form their own defensive pacts. The smaller species will be forced to choose sides based on fear rather than mutual benefit. She raised the plasma pistol slightly, drawing everyone's attention back to it. And in the chaos that follows, both the Velinary and the Korath will find themselves isolated and surrounded by enemies. Your war will be the spark that ignites a galactic conflict that makes your current dispute look like a minor disagreement. Elder Thizes spoke again, her voice trembling with emotion. Ambassador Carter, there must be another way. Humanity cannot simply abandon us. Helen felt tears forming in her eyes. There is another way, Elder Thizes, the Velinary can agree to dismantle their weapon. The Korath can withdraw their fleets. Both sides can return to the negotiating table and work out their differences like civilized beings. And if they refuse? Asked the Christic chairman, his rocky voice filled with dread. Helen raised the pistol to her own temple. Then I will pull this trigger, and my death will be the signal for humanity's withdrawal from the galaxy. The evacuation plans are already prepared. Within 6 months, there will be no humans left in galactic space. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the station's life support system seemed deafening. Every delegate was staring at Helen with a mixture of horror and respect. She was offering to die rather than let galactic civilization destroy itself. Overlord Zenth was the first to speak. You would truly sacrifice your own life to prevent this war. I would sacrifice my life to prevent genocide, Helen corrected. The weapon you've created doesn't just threaten the Korath. It threatens the fundamental principle that civilized beings can resolve their differences without mass murder. War Master Thokran looked at her with something that might have been admiration. The human shows more courage than many warriors I have known. To face death for the sake of others is the highest form of honor. Helen kept the pistol at her temple, her hand steady despite the emotional turmoil she felt inside. The choice is yours. You can have your war and watch galactic civilization collapse, or you can step back from the brink and remember why we formed this council in the first place. For several long minutes, no one moved. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance as two proud species considered whether their conflict was worth destroying everything they had built together. Finally, Overlord Zenth stood up. The Velinary Collective agrees to dismantle the stellar destruction weapon. We will also withdraw our fleets from the border and return to peaceful negotiations. War Master Thokrin rose as well. The Korath Empire accepts this offer. Our fleets will return to defensive positions. The war is over. Before it began, Helen slowly lowered the pistol, her hand shaking slightly now that the immediate crisis had passed. The chamber erupted in relief and applause as delegates realized that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. A human diplomat had prevented a galactic war by threatening to remove humanity from the galaxy entirely. As she walked out of the council chamber, Helen understood why humans were trusted to enter unarmed. It wasn't because they carried no weapons, but because they were willing to turn those weapons on themselves rather than watch innocent people die. The galaxy trusted human judgment because humans had proven that they would sacrifice everything, including their own lives, for the greater good. Jake Morrison was waiting for her in the corridor, his face pale with concern. Helen, what you did in there, the risk you took? Helen put the pistol back in her briefcase and closed it. It wasn't a risk, Jake. It was a promise. If they had refused to compromise, I would have pulled that trigger, and humanity would have left the galaxy forever. She looked back at the council chamber, where delegates were already beginning the process of formal negotiations. That's why they trust us. Not because we're peaceful, but because we're willing to pay any price to keep the peace. Even if that price is everything we've built out here among the stars.